Okay, welcome everybody to our discussion of Judaism and the ethics of war. I will be going through the sources, but the full documentation are found in articles at the top of the handout. And this Torah teaching is dedicated to Acheinu Kol Beit Yisrael, Haneturim B'Tzara B'Shivya, Haumdim Bein B'Yam Uvein B'Yabasha, Hamakom Yerachim Aleihem V'Yotziim Yitzara B'Ravacha, Mi'afela L'Ora, Mishibur L'Gula, Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv, and let us say, Amen. Okay, the focus of the ethics of Jewish war are the types of war. The typology of war is dependent upon two things: its legitimation and its conduct. The Talmud classifies wars according to their source of limitation by using two terms. Normally, the biblically mandated wars are termed a mitzvah war, a milchemet mitzvah, and a discretionary war is called milchemet reshut. Neither of these categories are totally clarified. The first is milchemet mitzvah. Some people think that means it's a mitzvah to go to war. Other people explain the phrase milchemet mitzvah, meaning in performing this war, you're doing a mitzvah. Not that the war is commanded, but in its conduct, you are performing a mitzvah. The other is milchemet reshut, which is frequently translated as a discretionary war. Probably a mistranslation. The phrase milchemet reshut means milchemet reshut beit din. That is, a war which has been authorized by the beit din. Another word for the beit din is the word edah. Another word for the word edah is the Sanhedrin. Now we're going to see, surprising. One would have thought that a tradition which in a majority of its time lacked a land, lacked an army, and rarely went to war, would be impoverished of significant reflection on war. The major change in his thinking is caused by the Rambam. Maimonides created a category, and that category is called Hilchot Melachim Umilchamtehem, almost the end of his famous book, the Mishnah Torah. The Hilchot Melachim means the laws of kings or the laws of governance and their wars. Amazingly, Maimonides really created this category of halachic discussion. Before Maimonides, if I asked you to go to a place in rabbinic literature in which you have concentrated a discussion of war, you can't find it. It's all over the place. Maimonides put them together, and his two major contributions were Hilchot Teshuvah and Hilchot Milchama. He created the categories, and amazingly, his comments on these way back in the 12th century remain the best comments on the subject of Teshuvah and Milchama. Okay, so back to the categories of Milchemet Mitzvah. There are three types of mandatory wars. Joshua's wars of conquest against the 7 Canaanite nations. The second is the war against Amalek. And the third are defensive wars against an already launched attack. Of these three categories, it can be argued that only the third is relevant today. According to the Talmud, the 7 Canaanite nations no longer have their national identity. Since he is so in another place, these groups are no longer identifiable, and therefore the category is no longer relevant. With regard to Amalek, there are those who say that the fate of Amalek is shared by the 7 Canaanite nations, and they lost their identity. Others argue that the category of Amalek only applies to pre-Messianic wars. What is most strange a source which I've never seen quoted, but should be known well, is from the book of Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 33, says that the tribe of Simon, did away with Amalek totally, did away with Sherita Pleta, that the last remnants of Amalek were destroyed in a war with the tribe of Shimon. Therefore, according to Chronicles, Amalek no longer existed already in First Temple times, and therefore they've disappeared from history over 2,500 years ago. So when anybody uses the category of Amalek, it is used metaphorically and generally to promote a specific political agenda. Now the question is, what are discretionary wars? And who is allowed to authorize the declaration of a war? There are 2 or 3 groups involved in the declaration of war. There is the head of the government, the chief executive, which in ancient times was the king. There is that group which is supposed to represent the will of the people, and a judicial group called the Sanhedrin. And the third group are actually the people called up for drafting, the enlistment process. In the book of Deuteronomy, the last 2 are taken very seriously. There's a whole discussion of who can be enlisted and who cannot be enlisted. So the last resort, the will of the people or the morale of the army, plays a consequential role here. Now, what about the difference between the chief executive and the Sanhedrin? The chief executive, of course, in modern times would be the head of the Israeli government. The Sanhedrin, since it's representative of the people, would now be the Knesset, which is now voted in by the people. Although ancient times there was no voting, but the role was to represent the interests of the people. So in a defensive war, which everybody agrees is a mandatory war, it can be declared by the chief executive alone. Because that means that at this moment we are already under attack. Since we're already under attack, lives have to be saved. Therefore, there's no discretion involved, and the chief executive can call the war. Now, what about wars which are for expansion, or for economic reasons, or for quasi-military reasons? But at the moment of going to war, people's lives are not at risk. That needs the discretion of the Sanhedrin. Why cannot the king do this alone? So reflection on the subject focuses that a king going to war has too many political consequences for his position. According to the analysis, there are 2 factors involved. Factor 1 is he may be too desirous of going to war, because nothing unifies the people than going to war. And therefore the king can go to war to consolidate his political interest, to galvanize support for the king. The other reason is a king may not want to go to war for fear that it could affect his own economic interests or his own political interests. In any case, in a war in which a king is nogeya b'davar, which means he's an interested party, since he's an interested party and could personally gain by either going to war or not going to war, he is eliminated from the consideration. Who is obliged to make the consideration of going to war? That is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is mandated with 2 elements. Number 1, is the war legal? It's a legal body. 2, does it serve the interests of the people? Now, the interests of the people means the benefits must exceed the losses. Therefore, the Sanhedrin is obliged to assess how many people are likely to get killed in this war. And in going to the war, are we minimizing destruction or maximizing destruction? So the question has to be asked by the Sanhedrin, whether to go to war or not going to the war, will the ratio of the good exceed the ratio of the bad? And the only people who can make that assessment, according to the Halakha, is the Sanhedrin, because they are the most disinterested party. Now, why do I say that? Because in going to war, the judicial body almost always loses authority because the king conducts the war. We have saw that also in America in the growth of the imperial presidency, and the prerogatives of the president almost always grows at the time of war, and those prerogatives are frequently at the expense of the Senate, which is supposedly to make the treaties and to okay the going of war in modern American war if the war lasts for more than 30 days. So, repeat, in a defensive war, people already getting killed, therefore the executive alone can make the call. In a discretionary war, which means you don't have to go to war, but people can see it as advantageous to go to war, the assessment of the advantage is done by the Sanhedrin, because the king is considered an interested party, which means he's nogeya be'idut. This therefore affects how he assesses and evaluates the situation, and this is left to the Sanhedrin. But there's an intermediate category, and that is called preemptive war. Now, preemptive war means that the enemy is about to attack you, but the enemy has not yet attacked you. Now, if there's no choice in timing because you already are under attack, then the king has full authority to go to war. But in a preemptive war, discretion is used with regard to timing. Is this the proper timing? Since it's preemptive, you really have to go to war. So the phrase in the category of the halacha is haba, an enemy which is coming on you, to which there are two interpretations, and they divide with Rashi and the Miri. The first interpretation says haba means they've already crossed the borders and they are attacking. Therefore, it's a defensive war. The other one says haba means those who are coming, if they're on the borders and they have the means for attacking and have announced their intention, then one school of thought argues that is not a discretionary war, it's a defensive war. Now watch what I just said. They're on your border, they have the means of attack, and they've announced their intention. So one school of thought says that is already as if they have attacked, and therefore it's a defensive war, and therefore the king alone or the chief executive can declare war. The second school of thought argues that as long as they've not, and nobody at the moment is getting killed, then going to war determines, requires a certain amount of discretion. And since it demands discretion, we need the discretion, the reshut of the Beit Din. Now I say this because normally discussions of this translate Milchemet Reshut as optional wars or discretionary wars. But that's not how halacha functions. Halacha says if it's a discretionary war, the question is who makes the discretion? So the category of Milchemet Reshut is an abbreviated form of the phrase Milchemet Reshut Beit Din, meaning not the king, the other government body, which is least interested or least to benefit from making the decision, makes the assessment. Now, what is part of the assessment? Part of the assessment are two major factors. Number one, in going to war, less lives will be lost than by not going to war. That's an assessment. I'll repeat again. By going to war, less lives will be lost than going to war. So the function of going to war, according to this assessment, is to minimize the number of lives on your side, which means the advantages have to exceed the disadvantages. We don't have going to war as vendettas, meaning getting back at them unless at the moment causing harm. And that assessment is made by the Sanhedrin. Now, the other consideration, which is extraordinarily intense in Jewish literature, is the ethical conduct of war. And the two major questions are, who is subject to immunity, and what is subject to destruction? Now, this is quite interesting because in classical literature, war is called hell. The phrase used by Sherman when he went through the South. That means that once you go to war, there's no restraint. The goal is victory, and victory at all costs. For some reason, actually an obvious reason, that consideration does not consider itself in Jewish law. So there's constant reflection on who is subject to immunity and what is subject to destruction. So if you look at the line there, it says specifically, the estimations of one's own losses and one's own interest is insufficient for validating discretionary war. The total destruction ratio required for victory must be considered. This assessment involves a double intention. That is, the good must appear achievable and the evil reducible. Now, those two statements demand discretion, a judgment call. I'll repeat again, the good must appear achievable. It's not a vendetta. And the evil, since we're now already in war, must be reducible. Okay? So the example they always give is laying a siege to a city. The determination must be made as to whether it can be captured without destroying it. It's the capture of the city, not the destruction of the city. And there's no warrant for destroying a town for the purpose of saving it. Now, where are these laws learned from? So there are two statements which are found both in the book of Deuteronomy. Number one makes the statement that a tree should not be destroyed because it cannot run away from you. Now, two things are learned from this. What do you mean a tree cannot be destroyed because it cannot run away from you? So the first thing is, what kind of tree is this? It's a fruit tree. Other trees can be cut down if you can use them for armaments. That means if the cutting down of the tree advances the goal of victory, then it can be done. It's not what we call bal tashchit, wanton destruction. It's destruction for the purpose of construction. So if I cut down an oak tree and I use it as a battering ram, then that's not wanton destruction. It's to advance the goal of victory. But why would I cut down a fruit tree? Clearly, before I cut down the fruit tree, I've already taken its fruit. So the fruit cannot reappear until the following year. So my goal in cutting down the fruit tree is to minimize sources of food for the people under siege after the siege is carried out. Because while the siege is going on, the fruit tree is outside the walls of the city, so they don't have access to it. My destruction of the fruit tree is to cause them harm after the siege has been lifted. Why has the siege been lifted? Because they have surrendered. Therefore, it's wanton destruction. I have no right to have a vendetta. I am a right to cause cruelty and destruction and death if it promotes the goal of victory, but not if it's a vendetta. So oak trees can be cut down. Fruit trees cannot be cut down because that is an act of vengeance or a vendetta. Also, it says, don't cut down the fruit tree because it cannot run away from you. From here, they learn of the immunity of the non-combatant. That is, if somebody runs away from you and does not present a threat to you, you have no right to shoot him in the back. If, on the other hand, a combatant runs away with his arms, or if he's running away to regroup, then of course he can be killed because he presents a potential threat. But once he no longer presents a potential threat, meaning he's run away, not in an organized fashion, with no arms, then he cannot be killed. That would be a vendetta and wanton destruction, unnecessarily killing. The second part of this is a rule in Deuteronomy that a fourth side of the city has to be left open in a siege. Now, why would anybody besiege a city and leave a fourth side open? The function of the fourth side open is debated by the Ramban. The Ramban, Nachmanides, says it could be that you leave the fourth side open to cause soldiers to flee and therefore not to present a threat to you. And therefore it is a military advantage. The other argument is that it is moral. If people are running away and no longer present a threat to you, then you have no right to kill them. You only kill those who are potentially a threat to you. Now, it's a fascinating aside of this discussion. I was giving this lecture at a university in Houston. At the end of the lecture, when I focused upon the immunity of the non-combatant, the person who introduced me to this lecture, who was the head of the philosophy department of this university, said, "We want to thank Professor Kimelman for lying to us," which is really quite a surprising way of commenting. And when I asked her what she was up to, she said the following: "We all know that the doctrine of the immunity of the non-combatant got into Western law through Hugo Grotius. And since Hugo Grotius is 300 years or 200 years after Maimonides and 1,000 years after the Midrash, they could not have created it." I was quite surprised by her comment, because I then presented the book composed by Hugo Grotius, which has footnotes. And in the footnotes of this specific comment by Hugo Grotius, it says, "See Rambam, Mishnah Torah, Laws of Kings and Wars." So Hugo Grotius took it straight from the Rambam. The Rambam takes it straight from the Midrash Sifrei Devarim, that the Revach, the fourth side, must be left open, from which they derive the immunity of the non-combatant. Now, the non-combatant does not mean somebody who's not fighting right now. It means, is he potentially a combatant? Is he trained? Is he subject to weapons? Right? So the definition of a non-combatant means he does not present a threat in the present, and there's no evidence that he presents a threat in the future. On the other hand, if he does the opposite, then he becomes a quasi-combatant and can be done away with, or at least imprisoned. Okay, so these rules of the non-combatant. Now, the other side of this is, according to Jewish sources, is to what degree the sources are considerate of the moral stature of the soldier. So just like much weight is given to the immunity of the non-combatant, much weight is given to the moral quality or retaining the moral quality of the soldier. So let's look at this. It says here, the rules for sieges follow similar lines of thought. Number one, indefensible villages may not be subject to siege. Number two, negotiations with the enemy must proceed subjecting a city to hunger, thirst, or disease for the purpose of exacting a settlement. So before we besiege a city, we have to give them 3 days and an offer of peace. Only if they reject the offer of peace, then can they be besieged. So it says specifically, emissaries of peace must be sent to a hostile city for 3 days. You cannot just send an emissary and then immediately attack them. You must wait to give them time to respond. And if they open up the gates, they should not be besieged. And once they open up the gates, they're also not to be killed unless they present a military threat. Therefore, it goes on to say, even after the siege is laid, no direct cruelties against the inhabitants may be inflicted, and a side must be left open as an escape route. Now, really interesting, besides Maimonides, who has the richest reflection on the laws of war, another extraordinarily rich reflection is given by Philo. Philo is probably the most significant Jewish philosopher of the 1st century. He lives in Alexandria, Egypt. He is basically at the same time as Hillel HaZaken. And his reflections on war are considerable. Most amazing is his reflections on war come from a Jewish community in Alexandria, which up to his time never went to war. So this is what he says, Philo. I quote him extensively, along with Josephus, and then we'll move into the classical Jewish sources. Philo, reflecting this concern for the military ambiguity of moral scrupers, says the following. This is a statement about going to war. All this shows that the Jewish nation is ready for agreement and friendship, follow the cause, with all like-minded nations whose intentions are peaceful. Look at the qualification. Yet it is not the contemptible kind which surrenders through cowardice to wrongful aggression. Follow closely. Surrenders through cowardice to wrongful aggression. This is Philo, 1st century, Alexandria, Egypt. And he wrote the most extensive commentary on the Torah that existed up to his time. He therefore also comments on the rules for a besieged city. He says he extends it to axing fruit-bearing trees to include vandalizing the environments of a besieged city. Watch what he says here. Indeed, so great a love for justice does the law, that is the Torah, instill in those who live under its constitution, that it does not even permit the fertile soil of a hostile city to be outraged by devastation or by cutting down trees to destroy the fruits. Now watch what he does here. It's almost a classical rabbinic move. If you cannot cut down fruit trees, then apparently you cannot destroy the fertile soil. So, for example, the salting of soil that in future years cannot be used would be prohibited. That would be wanton destruction and a vendetta, because the access to the soil would only be after the siege is lifted and the people have made peace. So therefore you cannot destroy the soil. So it's a classical rabbinic move. The Torah says, don't destroy a fruit tree. For future, they will get their fruit from the tree. Therefore, what you cannot destroy is destroy the soil. The soil at this moment, if there is vegetables or produce, you've taken them already. So the destroying of the soil could only be in vendetta, preventing future use of that. Now, same idea is found in Josephus. Josephus, about a century later, he basically writes after the destruction of the Second Temple. His major books are the Antiquities, the Wars. He has a vitae, his life. But in the Antiquities and the War is his most extensive treatment of explanation of Judaism. And he expands the prohibition to include, what's his language? The incineration of the enemy's country and the killing of beasts employed in labor. That's what he says. Despoiling the countryside, watch the words very closely, without direct military advantage comes under the proscription of profligate destruction. That is Baal Tashchit. Destruction for the sake of destruction. So he's expanded Philo's category, not only the fertile city, but the enemy's country and the killing of beasts employed in labor. Now, you can capture the beasts, you can use them, but you have no right for wanton destruction to kill the beasts. After all, who's going to use these beasts after the siege? That means the city would suffer from years after the war is over. That is prohibited. Now, the same ideas of Josephus and Philo get expanded upon by the medieval commentaries. I'm going to go through three as representative. One is Abraham ibn Ezra, Maimonides, and Sefer HaChinuch. Let's start with Abraham ibn Ezra. He is a philosopher, a poet, an astronomer, a grammarian, an exegete. He's a polymath. There's nobody, as far as I know, in the Middle Ages who had the range of talents that Abraham ibn Ezra, who lived from 1089 to 1164, probably born in Andalusian Spain, and probably died in England. But he specifically says, why fruit trees? So he says, fruit trees are singled out as a source of life. Therefore, Philo and Josephus, taking that idea, expanded upon it. Anything which is a source of life, which means fertile soil, or even animals of burden, which can help you make a living. And he says specifically, war is no license for destroying what is needed for human life. That's a look at the generalization. War is no license for destroying what is needed for human life. That's a vendetta, a revenge. The goal is victory. The goal is eliminating the enemy, maybe even eliminating the enmity. But once that has been eliminated, there is no authorization to destroy more. Now look what Maimonides does about 1 century later. After Ibn Ezra, he extends the prohibition to exclude all wanton destruction. And he specifies what he means by wanton destruction. He says, also, one who smashes household goods, tears clothes, demolishes a building, stops up a spring, destroys articles of food with destructive intent, transgresses the command, you shall not destroy. Lashchit, bal tashchit, and gives you the source. Now this is remarkable that we're talking about unnecessary destruction. If the destruction can be justified as leading to victory, then it's not bal tashchit. It's not unnecessary destruction. It is necessary destruction. But if the destruction is nothing more than to get back, but does not advance the goal of victory, then it comes under the prohibition, you shall not destroy, found in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19. Now, why are all these things done? So there are two considerations. Consideration number one is do not commit unethical acts. Now, why should you not commit unethical acts? Again, there are two considerations. One is, of course, the victim who is being hurt undeservedly. But the other consideration is very strong in Jewish law, is the moral construct of the soldier or the person doing the destruction. Because once you start destroying, it becomes very easy to destroy again. Once you start killing, it becomes easy to kill again. So look at what he says here. Maimonides says, the goal is to control the destructive urges provoked by war. So the Ramban expands upon this. He says it's impossible to go to war without brutalizing human nature. Even if you kill people legitimately, you kill people. And once you've killed a human being, it becomes easier to kill another human being. Therefore, the ethical quality of the soldier must be maintained, because when the war is over, the soldiers get reintegrated back into civil society. And once you've committed an act, no matter what the justification is, it becomes easier to commit the act, even if the justification no longer exists. Human nature is a continuum. So both Maimonides and Nachmanides are very much concerned about the ethical quality of the soldier and the limitations of destructiveness, especially wanton destruction. On the other hand, neither one precluded those acts which advance the goal of victory. Now, the third consideration here is the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch, we're not too sure who the author is. There's many different theories. And he clearly is aware of the Rambam, states the following, that the prohibition against wanton destruction was meant, I'm quoting him, I translated by quoting him, to teach us to love the good and the purposeful and to cleave to it so that the good will cleave to us and we will distance ourselves from anything evil and destructive. This is quite a remarkable ethical insight for even soldiers going to wars where the conversation takes place. I repeat again, to teach us to love the good and the purposeful and to cleave to it, davek, so that the good will cleave to us and will distance ourselves from anything evil and destructive. And this is called, with regard to wanton destruction. Now, follow closely. Even positive destruction, which leads to the goal of victory, creates a precedent and can create a moral precedent. As the Ramban says, you cannot go to war without a barbarization of the human sense of morality. That does not mean you should not go to war, and that's why the Sanhedrin is obliged to assess that the good exceeds the bad, and therefore has to know how much bad will occur, how much good will occur, and make sure that the good exceeds the bad. And if not, then the war is not justified. Okay, now, so this is there wanton destruction, reversed to two types of categories. Property land and human beings. Okay? And that's why the fourth side of a besieged city must be left open, and why unarmed soldiers have the chances of becoming refugees. And if that's clear, if unarmed soldiers have chance of becoming refugees is why you leave the fourth side open, then surely non-combatants and other neutrals have the same rights. Okay? So the principle is stated, do not commit harm to those who do not intend harm. One can commit harm to those who potentially can harm you. But if people you see as no potential to harm you, you have no right to harm them. Thus, the Abarbanel makes the following generalization. With regard to the immunity of women and children, he says the following. Since they do not make war, they do not deserve to die in it. Remarkable generalization. Since they do not make war, they do not deserve to die in it. So what's the converse? Those who make war deserve to die in it, unless they what? Stop making war. And this theme of the Abarbanel, which is in the 1500s, who left Spain, then left Portugal, ended up in Naples, was a minister of treasury, and writes probably the most comprehensive commentary to the whole Tanakh that had ever been written up to that time. Then Philo says, the Jewish nation, when it takes up arms, distinguishes between those whose life is one of hostility and the reverse. And the reverse is very significant here. For to breathe slaughter against all, even those who have done very little or nothing amiss, shows what I would call a savage and brutal soul. Okay, now I want to now compare this with the normal discussions of just war theory, primarily in Catholicism and also in Protestantism, and underscore the difference between the two. Okay, first place, just war theory is implied in these sources, but the category itself is a category used in Catholic canon law. Just war theory has three elements. Number one, just cause. Two, legitimate authority. And three, right intention. Now, all these are involved in the Jewish discussion, but the question is, who makes the decision that it's a just cause? Two, what is legitimate authority? And three, what is the right intention? These three things are very good, but they're not very helpful in going to war unless you know who makes the decision. So it's remarkably, what you don't have in Catholic law, what you do have in Jewish law, is the distinction between the chief executive and the Senate. And under what considerations can the chief executive be disqualified? And it could be because in going to war could end up serving his political interests. That is, you could have a president who doesn't want to go to war in an election year because he thinks it could hurt his chances for re-election. And you can have a president who wants to go to war in an election year because he thinks it can help the cause of his re-election or his initial election. My only point being that a person who could most benefit to go to war is least qualified to decide whether to go to war. So the legitimate authority in Catholic law was almost always left to the king. So in this sense, Jewish law is a little bit more sophisticated than Catholic law in its medieval expression by giving authority to the Sanhedrin in any discretionary war. So the king only has total authority if the country is already under attack. And the purpose of going to war is to legitimate deaths on your side. Then it's the king. But any other type of war in which you engage and go into the side of the enemy and increase the number of losses, that's not prohibited. But the discretion and the judgment has to be made by the Sanhedrin. Now the next two categories. Proportionality and last resort. And people use these categories all the time. Neither one appears in Jewish considerations. Why? Number one, how do you measure proportionality? So I was at a conference of peaceniks, Christian, Jews, and Muslims. And one Muslim walked up to me and he was discussing a war by Israel at the time, years ago, and he kept using the word proportionality. So I said to him, tell me, if somebody killed your mother, raped your wife, and tortured your daughter, what would you consider proper proportionality? And he didn't respond. In other words, it's impossible to measure proportionality. Are you saying we kill 100 of them because of 10 of us? So as long as they continue the war and refuse to surrender, the numbers are not significant. Of course, you will maximize their deaths and minimize your deaths. Now, the other category, which is called last resort, also does not appear, as far as I know, in our sources, for the simple reason that no human being knows what the last resort is. Who knows that another resort may appear on the scene? Therefore, if proportionality and last resort are not given to normal human judgment, and none of the judgment that the Sanhedrin can use, and the only exception being, as I mentioned before, the Sanhedrin, before it gives its okay, has to argue that the good will exceed the evil. If that's what they mean by proportionality, then fine. But if they mean, well, we only killed 10 of you, and therefore you can only kill 10 of us, that's absurd. We can kill 10 of you, and we can kill 1,000 of you, back and forth. The point is to stop the war and to stop the killing. How much killing it takes to stop the war cannot be judged in advance. And therefore, the category of proportionality, meaning we kill each other equally, or last resort, is eliminated, because human beings never know what the last resort is. There can be another resort, and therefore those are not categories. Now, one of the reasons of this great difference between Catholic thinking on the subject and Jewish thinking on the subject is that Catholic thinking is primarily the result of theologians who are significantly also trained in philosophy. Jewish authorities are almost all trained in law. They also may be philosophers, but their primary consideration for prominence in Jewish consideration is their knowledge of halakha and training in law, and therefore making judgments, not theoretically, but practically. And therefore, any ethical consideration has to be measurable. And if you can't measure it, you can't use it. So there's a major difference between the two. Now, in our next session, we're going to discuss the human dimensions of the war, the image of the soldier and the man of the enemy. I'll develop that more. And the two distinctions in war being mandatory wars and discretionary wars. Are these categories mixed? We're going to find that many of the rules with regard to discretionary war found in the book of Deuteronomy were applied by native authorities to mandatory wars, which means that mandatory wars also come under ethical scrutiny. Then we're going to deal with something extraordinarily strange in the book of Deuteronomy, is a number of exemptions. People are exempt based upon their marital status, their economic status, and apparently on their psychological status. The question is why? And finally, we're going to discuss the application of the category of Amalek, because that category has been reused recently, and we like to judge from classical sources the validity of its application. Okay, that allows us for a couple of minutes of discussion and give and take on material that we did deal with. Please don't ask me questions. We hope to deal with the next session next Wednesday night, same time, same station.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kimelman. At this point, if you have any questions or thoughts, as long as it's not a grandstand, feel free to unmute your line. You talk about the one who's most nogeh badavar, usually the king, the president, the leader. In a country where we don't have a Sanhedrin anymore, is that role then substituted by the Knesset or parliament?
Yeah, many modern halakhic authorities in Israel, especially those who belong to Dati Lumi, which means their children join the war, argue that the function of the Sanhedrin was to represent popular sovereignty. That's the expression they use, means to express the will of the people. The only group in Israel which is elected and can reflect, as it were, the will of the people or the political will of the people is the Knesset. Therefore, they argue that the categories of kings can apply to the Rosh Memshalah, the prime minister, and the categories of the Sanhedrin representing the Eidah, or popular sovereignty, applies to the Knesset. And in doing so, they bridge the gap between the institutions of the past, institutions of the present, and therefore the restrictive laws of war would apply insofar as the war is legitimate. So let me give you several cases important. In 1948, Israel was clearly under attack, and they responded by 5 nations which attacked them. On the Yom Kippur War, if anybody saw the movie Golda, knows that Israel was clearly under attack, and they responded. So both would be called defensive wars with no compunctions. Now, the 6-Day War is a fascinating case in Jewish law, because while the enemy was on our border, and while the enemy announced it was about to attack, and while the enemy had the means of attack and already closed the Straits of Tiran, they had not yet attacked. So this is the great debate between Rashi and Amiri. That is, if they're on your border and they have the means of attack and their intention has already been proclaimed, can you attack them as a defensive war or as an offensive war? Now, what's the difference in issue? The issue is, before you attack them, you need the approval of the Sanhedrin, the Knesset. In other words, since timing is up to you, then you have a right to consult with the Sanhedrin, who makes a judgment of the benefit to the people and their losses. If they've already attacked, then the function of the counterattack is to limit casualties. Therefore, the head of the government does not need to consult the Sanhedrin because they're already under attack. So the great debate between Rashi and the Miri would apply to the 6-Day War, because while they were on the borders, we initiated the actual war. Now, some people say my analysis is incorrect, because since Egypt had closed the gates of Tiran, and since the closing of that, the Straits of Tiran, is considered a casus belli, a cause for war, they argue the war already started. Israel was responding. That may be legitimate, but according to Jewish calculation, they want to know, are people being killed, and therefore the going to the war is minimize the killing. So it's a question of a strict or more liberal interpretation. So those who would argue it was strictly a defensive war, then it was called by the chief executive. Those who argue that it could only be a defensive war if the enemy is already attacked, and therefore they consult the Sanhedrin. So the 6-Day War, we know there was both the opposition party and the ruling party joined together. So even according to that, you had Knesset representation.
Very good, thank you. We have several more questions. This question is about destructive weaponization that will maybe kill combatants, but kill others as well, non-combatants. And specifically, the person asks, how does Hiroshima apply to the killing of innocents? You could even apply napalm or cluster bombs or others that will, again, kill, or take out a wider swath of people.
Okay, so first, Hiroshima, you have to say Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Sure.
There were 2 uses of the bombs, and while many people justify the first, they do not justify the second. So I did a little investigation to this question, because while Nagasaki and Hiroshima were atomically bombed, Tokyo was burned down. So according to what I read, it turned out that there were more victims to the burning of the city as opposed to the bombs. But one must be careful of the following. I don't know if people know this, but after the first bomb, America waited and hoped that the emperor would surrender. The emperor did not surrender. So the second attack only took place only took place, right, when the emperor refused to surrender, and this was to bring him to the knees. After the second bombing, they surrendered. So now the question is, the standard ratio was more good or more bad affected? Okay, so far as I know, President Truman estimated that to attack Japan, he would lose 300,000 soldiers. That's what the data assessment is. Now, his first goal is to protect American soldiers. The second goal is to limit destruction to the non-combatant of the enemy, insofar it does not affect the outcome of the war. If the means to affect the outcome of the war, then the question is, how can that be done quickly with the minimum number of deaths? So that would take an estimation. I'm not making a position on the subject whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying that people have to make an estimation of it, and the people that make this estimation should be the military, but the military alone, according to Jewish law, should not be doing it because they may be too interested. Therefore, a Sanhedrin or an independent judicial body should pass approval or disapproval.
We have a question from Nissan Hershkowitz, and if you want to add to your question, Nissan, just unmute your line. Did the Sanhedrin utilize the Urim V'Tumim on their own discretion for this type of decision? So maybe the role of the Urim V'Tumim in war.
Yeah, that is a really important question.
Is, you mentioned that that they represent the people. If they're using Urim V'Tumim when it was available, it seems that this is not simply channeling the people's will.
Okay, the Urim and Tumim come up with the following discussion. There are those who argue that therefore the war is illegitimate because it's not the Urim and Tumim, and the others argue that the Urim and Tumim is only obligatory if there are Urim and Tumim. But if there's no access to Urim and Tumim, then it's not obligatory. Can we make the distinction clear? So the people, by people I mean halachis, who argue on two sides of this. Someone would say you have to have Urim V'Tumim because it's mandated. And the others say, no, you only are mandated to use Urim V'Tumim if they're available. And if not, not. Those people who argue the second way also say with regard to a king. They'll say a certain war requires a king, but that's only if what? If there is a king, then the king has to be consulted and call the shots. But if there is no king, now I didn't go that tactic. I follow those of modern Israeli authorities who argue that the head of the government of Israel functions as a melech. He is responsible for the welfare and the defense of the people. So you could argue, they say, that a Rosh Memshalah, the prime minister, and the Sanhedrin are the functional equivalents, not the exact equivalents, of the king and the Sanhedrin. Therefore, the rules which apply to one apply to the other. Okay?
No, the point of my question was to challenge those who say that the Sanhedrin, the role of the Sanhedrin has been replaced by the Knesset today. I don't see the similarity.
I'm not quite clear. We're arguing the Sanhedrin is called the Beit Din. It's called the Eidah. Two phrases are used. There are those who say this. Their argument is the function of the Sanhedrin and the function of the Eidah was to assess popular opinion and the chances of victory. Hold closely. Chances of victory and popular opinion. Now, the chances of victory also include that more good will be accomplished than evil, which is not always the case when you go to war. That's their judgment call. So the argument is, if that was the function of the Sanhedrin, and the Knesset in modern Israel has to give its approval, because you need both parties involved or a majority of it to represent it. In fact, if the government fell, then the war effort would fall. I mean, if anybody follows the machinations of the present Prime Minister of Israel, he's matching two things. He's got to keep the government together, and he's got to fight a war. And the government that he runs has diverse opinion. So he is really the master manipulator. If he keeps it going, it's quite remarkable. If he's able to achieve his goals and keep his party unified, it's remarkable. Just think of the trouble that Biden is having right now on certain things he wants with regard to military considerations. Anyhow, those who argue the case, and you could disagree, argue that the king and Sanhedrin are the functional equivalents of the Rosh Hashanah and the Knesset. And for the decision-making body is divided between the two, as we articulated earlier. Otherwise, you have to argue that Jewish law has no relevance to the contemporary situation. You could argue that because institutions don't exist. Get it? And there are those who argue that way and argue that it's defunct, right? Those who want to see continuity between present reality and past reality, and that the ethical rulings which apply to one apply to the other, underscore continuity. A lot of it depends on what degree you see the significance of the present Israeli government as Jewishly significant, as ethically significant, and as Torah mandated. And now we're getting to a serious political discussion, which is not really relevant to what I'm talking about here. And the opinion of this subject is great.
It is very good. We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to combine two questions, or question and comment, and that will be with a Zoom user, with Azaria Bezalel, and then we'll conclude with a question from Marshall Potter. If you were to exclude children in infants, young children, in infants, is it possible that there is no such thing as innocence otherwise, because the population as a whole supports the enemy? And I know one perspective is that, if you just to take the current situation, are those who supported Hamas automatically swept into or incorporated with the more narrow definition of Hamas? Or would you say that potentially sometimes the citizenry doesn't really have a choice in a dictatorial format?
But let me try to break down to some of its pieces.
A lot of people, I was going to say it's many components, I realize.
I didn't want to make explicit comments on the contemporary situation, but
Fine.
I guess I'm obliged. First thing is, you should realize the Hamas has 30 to 40,000 soldiers. All these come from families of Gaza. Almost all of them were trained in summer camps, which trained the people to kill Israelis. So Hamas really is a citizen army. It's not a professional army, it's a citizen army. They could not have 30 to 40,000 soldiers with an extraordinary amount of popular support. Every study that I know which is made of the Arab population, I do not use the word Palestinians, because that term was chosen to delegitimate Israel. They are Gazans. You can call them Arabs, but it's not specifically. They come from a place called Gaza, so call them Gazans. It's a good term. Gazans, as far as I know, every study which is done, found that Hamas is extraordinarily popular, more than Fatah. Secondly is, the goal of destroying Israel is popular in Gazan sections. Third, which is most important, I don't know any country which went to war, which went out of its way to allow people who wanted to leave the war to flee to the south. And of course, many people who fled were actually Gazans, soldiers dressed up as regular Gazans, because they can mix with the population. You know why? Because they're part of the population. So they went with their families. And Israel knew that. Nonetheless, apparently if you didn't have your arms with you, they let you go. Even though these people know when they get to the south, they could get rearmed if they got there. So Israel, I don't know, we didn't do that in Afghanistan. We clearly did not do that in Vietnam. We did not do that in Iraq. That is, we actually risked the military venture, not totally, but a little bit, to allow for these ethical considerations. In that sense, the war in Gaza, I don't know any war which is fought that way. For example, Syria has over 400,000 people killed, 2 million kicked out of the country. Almost those who are protesting from Gaza, I don't know of any of those groups which protest what's going on in Syria. Right now, there's a war in Darfur, which people don't remember anymore because Jews are not involved. There's over 1 million people say victims, either displaced people or killed. Has anybody raised the ethical issue? So it's remarkable. Around the world, almost everybody expects Jews to behave differently. So what my opinion is, my own personal opinion, deep down, Muslims and Christians can't get the thought out of their mind that the Jews are the chosen people and that they came to supplant them, and therefore they want to always give them secondary status because they believe they are the chosen people. So I think there's a direct correlation between anti-Semitism and eliminating the contender for chosenness. So even Hitler, by the way, who was interviewed in 1941 by a reporter called Rosenberg, not a Jewish name, a German name in those days, asked Hitler, why do you hate the Jews so much? And his answer was, because the Germans are the chosen people. So I would say there's a direct correlation. The more you think you are chosen, the more you want to eliminate the only contender. Now, many people in the world think they're the chosen. The French think they're chosen. The Polish think they're chosen. The Russians think they're chosen. In all literatures, they believe in what is called exceptionalism. But the French don't consider the Germans chosen, and the Germans don't consider the Polish chosen. But all of them, if they're Christian or Muslim, realize that the Jews were once chosen. And some people deep down think they are. So I think there's a direct correlation between those who think they are chosen and the desire to eliminate the primary contender, and the only contender who believes that it's chosen besides its own people are the Jews. In fact, you have demonstrations both in Israel and America of Christians for Israel to save what? The chosen people. Now, they believe if you save the chosen people, then the chosen one will come again. Well, we can wait for that in the meantime.
We have a final question from Marshall Potter, and then I'll just offer a quick conclusion. This is from Marshall. As you stated, much of what the halacha is based on is the destruction of fruit trees in the land from Sefer Devarim, Bal Tashlit. If the purpose is beneficial for winning the war, then it is permitted. What is your analysis of flooding the tunnels with water that may destroy the underground water sources in Gaza? I'll frame this as a question. Does it seem that it may shorten the war? And if so, at what cost? And is that justified?
Well, it's a fascinating question. There's another, if you want to really get into this issue, the argument is that the water will destroy the ground around it.
The
And
soil.
if you talk about Josephus and Philo, right? But the question right now is, not are you causing harm, but are you minimizing the total harm? That's what you have to ask yourself. Is the good exceed the bad? So it's not whether people are getting killed. And by the way, the primary people in the tunnel, the primary people are, of course, soldiers, and they're all armed, and they come out at all different types of places. Now, what would you rather do? Go in there and have your men sometimes get killed because it can easily be surprised, or threaten them with water? Now, when you threaten them with water, they can solve the problem. All they have to do is come out and surrender. The people who surrender are not getting killed. Okay? And if they come out now, if they refuse to surrender, then it's like a besieged city. They refuse to run away. Well, if they refuse to run away, that means they want to kill you. Well, if they want to kill you, then you have a right to what? Kill them. Especially when you told them in advance that we're going to bring water to the tunnels. Do what? Get out of there. They have the option. If they don't get out of there, that means they're a combatant. Like any other combatant in war, they're subject to getting killed.
Very good, thank you.
On the other hand, if they come out and they put down their weapons and they're no longer a threat, then they should not be shot or killed. That's clear. Get it? If they come out and put down their weapons very carefully, right? They'll not be shot or killed. They must be taken care of and put them in prison, but you're not allowed to physically harm them if they to present no threat to you. But if they do present a threat to you, and you got to make sure they're disarmed, that's why they made many of these guys in their underwear, because all types of guns and knives you can hide. But if they present no threat to you, they didn't shoot and kill them. They didn't do anything like they did when they crossed into kibbutzim and killed the women and children and raped them. If they're no longer a threat, then you have no right to kill them. But you have an obligation to make sure they're no longer a threat.
Thank you very much.
So put the water in the tunnels is not a good thing to do. But if you have to measure the good versus the bad, and you give the choice, we will not put water in the tunnel. If you come out and surrender, then you've met the ethical requirements.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kimelman. I just want to repeat, I started in the beginning, and then we ran into a technical issue. I just want to thank some of the contributors and supporters of tonight's program. We do want to thank the Kaplan JCC of the Palisades here in New Jersey. Also, partners One Mesa Friedel in honor of Rabbi Kimelman. Most of these are actually in honor of Rabbi Kimelman and recognition of Rabbi Kimelman's scholarship and really contributions to Klal Yisrael for many decades. To Daniel Reuven as well. Supporters, Dr. Sandra Gold in recognition of Rabbi Kimelman. Friends, Alexander, if I mispronounce your name, I do apologize. Alexander Brian, Rabbi Noah Gradowski, who bailed me out, so thank you very much. Chaplain Leslie Kersner, in memory of Jan Blumenthal Eng, Rabbi Leonard Levy, myself in honor of Rabbi Kimelman, also the UTJ for 40 years of scholarship and friendship and community. Ozzy Orbach, Rabbi Robert Pilavin, Dr. Burden Sherrill, in recognition of Rabbi Kimelman. Thank you as well to anyone and everyone who made a donation with your registration. There are links in the chat, including the source sheet for this presentation. Also, as Rabbi Kimelman mentioned at the very outset, we will resume next week, same day, same time, but a different date, February 14th. So look forward to seeing everyone and have a good rest of the week. Tia Bari.
V'shalom al Yisrael.